Welcome everyone to our QBL Conversations. I'm Davana Robedee. I'm joined today with Jeannette DeNicolis Meyer. Jeannette is one of our longtime QBL faculty who we really love having. And the one thing that really always excites me about Jeannette's teaching and her classes is she does teach a wide range of skills and techniques. She's kind of masterful when it comes to dyeing, using odd materials, bagaji, just about everything. And it's really great to have her invite us to see her studio and see her today because we missed her this year. How are you doing, Jeannette?
I'm doing well. I'm a little tired of this. How about you?
A little bit tired of this. It has been nice to catch up with everyone, and we're sad that we're not doing QBL, but it's been cool to kind of get a window into everyone's studio space. Have you been doing anything interesting during the quarantine?
Other than making hundreds of masks, you mean? Like everyone else?
Have you exited your mask phase? Because I know there are some people who went into it and then came right out the other side yet.
Well, I entered it and made masks for all the family members, and then charity organizations needed masks. And then, you know, the person that you are just kind of comes through even when you're doing something as mundane as maths. It was like, how can I change this to make it better? Because as we were going on our bike rides, I don't know if you've exercised with your mask on, but when you're huffing and puffing, you're breathing the masks in, which is really uncomfortable. So I've come up with this great new mask made out of, with stays in it, made out of materials that we had around the house, so that it's kind of like an underwire bra.
That's great.
Fabulous. It keeps it away from your face as you're breathing. And I'm thinking as I'm making these, week 19 of quarantining, and this is what I'm doing, is making masks. But yes, I'm also making quilts at the same time, but masks just seems more necessary.
But I wanted to ask you about, I've sort of been interested in everyone's maybe origin story of how they got into quilting and how they started out on their path. And can you tell us a little bit about your quilt journey?
It's been a long time. I've always drawn and painted and made stuff. But when I was in college back in the Jurassic Age, a nephew was arriving, didn't have a whole lot of money. I made my own clothes, so I had a sewing machine. I knew how to sew. And so I drew a picture and cut it out of fabric and sewed it onto fabric and then machine quilted it together. This is before people were doing machine quilting, but I didn't know what you were supposed to do with quilts. I hadn't read any books. It was so fun to do. It was just like drawing with fabric and a sewing machine. And I, from there, did a couple of traditional quilts and then quickly just started designing my own work. But it was just another art material, just another art supply, really. And of course, after that, you know, a bunch of books came. There were, I think, 3 books on the market about quilting way back in the 70s. But now, you know, you walk into a store and there are billions of them. But it was kind of nice to not know what you were supposed to do, to just be able to figure it out on my own.
The one thing I really like about your quilts is, well, number one, you have all these sort of metaphysical type titles, but without the titles, they do have that sort of spiritual feel, like water and sun and moons. And what kind of story are you telling in your work?
Well, I'm glad you feel that way about that there's something spiritual behind them. I am not a religious person, but I am always trying to figure out who we are, what we're doing here. The last series that I did was called Keeping Time, and it was, you know, partially because I'm getting older and trying to figure out what time is and realize that it's really something that man has invented. And so just kind of exploring the different ways we've told time, the different things that time means to us. And now I think I'm going back to that series because I don't know about you, but time is taking on a really weird configuration during this whole isolation lockdown thing. Do you know what the date is today? You know, it's like, I have to stop and think like, okay, today is Thursday, but the days sort of squish together. Whereas remember when you were little, how Christmas seems so long away. And now as an adult, it's like, really? We're doing that again? So it was a 4 or 5 year long series trying, exploring that. And that's kind of how I work. Is there's something that I'm thinking about that I'm trying to figure out, or something that I've read that's really made me stop in my tracks, which is kind of where the time thing started with, besides all the other background. I was reading a book about the origins of how we keep track of time. But that's sort of how it all comes together. There's connections I'm trying to make between things, emotions I'm trying to abstract into fabric. And then there are the baby quilts that I make just because it's fun to manipulate fabric. But that's a whole other thing.
It's interesting how a lot of people do start out with that same story of I sewed my own clothes, or I had a grandmother, an aunt, somebody who taught me, and eventually came back to it, or I needed to make a baby quilt. That seems to be the
right. And you have the skills already. I know how to draw. I know how to sew. Drawing with a scissor is not that different from drawing with another drawing utensil. So they're all just art supplies.
And can you talk a little bit about your process? Because I know sometimes, in fact, one of my favorite works of yours, I believe you use bark cloth, which is really difficult to work with, and you're known for using your own hand dyed fabrics and different things. Can you talk a little bit about how you get started and what inspires you?
Different things at different times. Usually the idea drives the materials that I use. So the bark cloth I started to use that because I was doing a series on essential maps that we use, but metaphorical maps and literal maps to use to navigate through our lives. And because I spend a lot of my time going back and forth to New Zealand, I really enjoyed looking into the different ways that the South Pacific people navigated. And there were some maps that I wanted to abstract. And I made the first couple out of my dyed fabric, and they were interesting and nice, but they didn't quite capture what I was wanting to do. And then when I was teaching in New Zealand and sort of thinking about it, I thought, I really need to use materials from this area to express this particular map. So that's because I realized I had to use that material. Then I had to figure out how in the world to actually manipulate this stuff, because it was not meant to be put through a sewing machine. It was not meant to be hand appliqued. But little things like that aren't going to stop me. And it's really kind of cool stuff. It's almost like felted tree fiber, the way it's put together. Someday I would really love to visit an island and watch the women making this stuff, because it's really, really cool stuff. But now I have a whole collection of bark cloth, and I'm kind of done with that series. So we'll see what happens.
Well, they're really beautiful. And I see you have a piece behind you. Is that something in progress? Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
That's a piece of fabric that I dyed, and I am deciding if it's going to get cut up or if it's going to be quilted. The thing about using hand-dyed fabric is it really is always one for the Journal of Irreproducible Results. I'm never going to get that fabric again. So I think long and hard before I cut it up or don't cut it up. So I'm not sure yet The other thing is, with that kind of fabric, you could get precious about it awfully easily. So sometimes it's just like 10 o'clock at night going, okay, rotary cutter in hand, cut this puppy up, because it's not doing you any good just hanging on the wall waiting for you to think of what to do. So I'll get back to you on what happens with that.
I can't wait. So since you're all holed up back at home in your wonderful studio, do you mind sharing with us your space?
Both of my studios are in my home. I don't have a separate studio. And they used to be all downstairs where the dye studio is now, in the basement. But eventually, kids do move out. And so you get a little bit more space. And so now I have this wonderful treehouse sort of studio upstairs where I get to do my design and construction work. And the dungeon downstairs where I do the dye work, where I can make a complete mess and it doesn't matter at all. I'm really lucky to have both of those spaces. But it doesn't matter how many spaces you have, you never have enough room.
Here's the downstairs studio where I dye and print my fabric. It has all these pinnable walls left over from when it used to be my design and construction studio as well. But now that the house is emptier, I got to take over an upstairs room that has windows and views of the trees, and it's a lot more pleasant place to do the design work. But this is a great space for doing the dyeing and printing. It's a basement. I can make it messy. It's easy to clean up. There's tons of storage for the dyes and paints that I need for my work. And the pinnable walls have become a mosaic of show announcements that remind me of the work that my friends and I are doing. It's a great space to work in. This is the studio I get to work in when I'm designing and sewing my quilts. It's upstairs, so I get this treetop view of the greenery. It's a little bit like working in a treehouse. My studio isn't usually quite this tidy, but I just got finished making a bunch of masks for donation and then cleaned up afterwards to get to work on the other things I'm working on. A couple of design walls, a couple of fabric storage spaces. This one has a lot of the dyed and printed fabric that I do, along with some of the bark cloth that I bring back from trips to New Zealand. A couple of quilts on the go, including this one that my son started 30 years ago that I found when I was cleaning out the basement studio a couple weeks ago. I think it might be time to finish it after 3 decades. And here's the piece that I'm working on now, trying to figure out what this pandemic is about and feels like to me. I'm really happy with the imagery, and now I'm moving on to trying to come up with a quilt design to finish it off with. So there are 4 or 5 different iterations there that are done on tracing paper. I also am a bookmaker, so I've been working with selvages that friends and students send me, because since I dye my own fabric, I don't have my own selvages, but I now have this fabulous wall of selvages to work with thanks to all of their donations. There's one more place where there is fabric, and it's this closet. What do you think? Almost enough fabric?
So tell us a little bit about what you would have been teaching at QBL. I think you were for next week.
I don't even remember what the name of the class was.
Finding the Flow.
Oh, that's it. Okay, thank you. Oh, I love that class. It is a class that encourages quilters, no matter where they are, if they're traditional quilters, established art quilters, or people who are trying to find which pond they want to swim in, make them realize that they already have a way of working and a voice, and to sort of go from there. Like if you're a traditional quilter and you love making log cabin quilts, there are a zillion directions to go in with log cabin quilts. If you're an art quilter and if you're not like me, if you don't work from ideas, but you work from material itself, like what can the fabric do? You can go in a whole lot of different directions. And so through some exercise, through a few compositional exercises, and there are also some technique things that I show, but mostly it's people digging down into what they already know how to do, just realizing many more possibilities than they thought before, and to stop this sort of caste system of this kind of quilt is better than that kind of quilt, because I love them all.
Yeah, we often, and I'm not sure why, occasionally I get told like, oh, you guys only prefer like art quilts. I'm like, that's not true. I love all of the quilts. I find that most quilt makers tend to be in both camps.
Yeah, I wonder if every art media is like this. There's, some cranky person in a room somewhere generating rules that nobody really believes, but people repeat.
Yeah. What rules have you broken lately, Jeannette?
I don't even think about them anymore, so I don't think about breaking them or not breaking them. That's something that when I'm trying to convince people to think about the quilting lines that they're putting on their quilts, it's something I really want them to think through. Like, they'll talk about, well, you can't cross your line with another line, and I like, where did that come from? Who made up these rules? Just no. What imagery do you want to put on your quilt? Either because it makes you happy or because it intensifies the meaning of what you're doing. That's what it's about. The rule is, why are you making it? What do you want out of it? And how can you get there?
Yeah.
Pretty simple.
Pretty simple.
Mm-hmm. and kind of know where it's going afterwards. If you're making a baby quilt, yeah, the rule is you need to make it so that it can be washed 5 or 6 times, right?
A day.
If it's going, yeah, right. If it's going on the wall of a gallery, why does it matter if the back is super neat? I mean, I'm incredibly stupid about this, so my backs are very neat, but why does it matter? Who turns a painting around to look at the back of it? So these sort of rules that might have made sense when you were making a useful quilt, but are now making an art quilt, people need to sit back and say, does this still make any sense?
Do you have anything you'd like to say to the students who we unfortunately had to cancel?
Working. I mean, I think one of the things that has really hit home with me during this pandemic is how lucky we, the makers, are. There have been entire days when I could shut out the rest of the world because I could come up to my studio and draw or sew or even make masks. I mean, to make something real that was only an idea and to have it come through your hands, I think is a gift that we all share. And I have some friends who don't do this stuff and they're going a little nuts. There are only so many TV shows you can watch and books you can read. There's nothing that makes time stop quite like being engrossed in getting an idea from your head out through your heart and your hands. And that's one of the things that I think everybody at QBL has in common.
Yeah, it's definitely a really wonderful community, and it's great to catch up with you guys and see what you're working on, and hopefully we can all be back next year. I mean, we're all sort of hedging our hopes on that. And thank you so much for having us over.
Thanks for coming. And stay healthy and vote.